I think in a world where these kind of parentings is not actually like in complete control of government, parents will always have their own subjective way to raise a child, starting from their childbirth, very beginning track. For example, especially if you are actually like underprivileged maybe, or even if you have privilege, everyone will have different way to actually like raise their children, very beginning track. This shows you that this ideal world can only be achieved if these parentings can only be achieved if everyone actually like have their own way of uniform way to actually like raise their children, right? Therefore, what OG going to do here is that we're going to make government to have the full control of how parents should like raise their children, simply because we want to implement a very uniform manner in terms of us to actually like make sure everyone will actually like grow up in the same way and do not actually like have a very big gap between each other, especially those who are privileged and underprivileged, very beginners, right? I think in the current status quo, the real portrayal of this problem will be on how a lot of like underprivileged children are actually like get stunting, for example, simply because their parents believe that, simply because their parents are actually like late giving them MPAC or don't even have like enough money to actually like buy them good foods, very beginners, right? I think in OG, these kind of problems will be so much solved simply because we're going to make government to actually like take control on how these parents are actually like going to like raise their children. For example, it's like when to actually like give their baby MPAC, when they should start putting their children to high school, on things like that, very beginners, right? We're not going to let government to actually like take full custody, but what we're going to do is that the government is going to be the actor here who actually like set certain standards, set the step-by-step mechanism that the certain that every parent needs to follow, simply because this is the kind of control that we want here, right? We're basically going to regulate on every single parent on how they should raise their children, very beginners, right? Not only we're going to create this step-by-step mechanism here, but at the end of the day, we're also going to make sure that their parents will actually like do reports towards the government on every single frequent time, right? It can be like 3 months, 6 months, and this report can be talking about on how the nutrition level, the education level, their performance, and etc. to very beginners, right? So that not only the government can actually like control on how these parents raise their children, but can also like keep track on how these children are actually like being comfortable towards the system to the very beginner track. So if opposition are actually like concerning on how children might do not like this uniform way of them being raised, at the end of the day, it can be evaluated towards these reports at the end of the day to very beginner track. This is basically the thing that we are going to do here. The moment we're talking about, we want government to have the complete control of the very beginner track. So yeah, I think what I'm going to talk about in my speech is basically I'm going to talk about on how we can at least have exact amount of standing point for everyone regardless of privilege here in OG. But sekarang I'm going to talk about on how at the end of the day we can actually like take their parents accountable better. But before going there, I think several stuff that need to be clarified first, very beginner track. First of all, I think it's a fiat if opposition saying that the parents will not actually want to adapt towards this very beginner track, because why will they want to give this up to the very beginner track? But I think this is something that's going to be a fiat simply because this house prefer debate to the very beginner track. What we need to do is actually compare in between roles on the idea of the feasibility to the very beginner track. So we need to assume that every single parents will want this to the very beginner track. But we also concede that maybe a lot of parents will reconsider to actually like having a child to the very beginner track, because why will someone want their children to be on how they want to raise their children to be in full control of government to the very beginner track? But I think this reconsidering by parents is actually something that's more beneficial for the government, simply because it will actually like eliminate those parents who actually wants to do abstract things towards their children, or even not ready for it to the very beginner track. But even more, I think the moment that we actually like have this full control, it will only help these parents at the end of the day, simply because it will actually like help them to guide on how they should actually like raise their children and make sure their children actually like going to grow up in a very great environment and also house at the very beginner track. So yeah, going to my first point of argument here. Yeah, I'm taking your question.
Is the standard going to be objective or subjective to each parent?
Of course, it's going to objective regardless if they have privilege or not. I'm going to explain later at the end of the day how at the end of the day it's still going to be work regardless if you don't have money and regardless if you're underprivileged. So yeah, going to my first point of argument here on how at the end of the day we can at least have exact amount of standing point here to the very beginner track. So judge, in the current status quo, if you're privileged or if you're basically if you're privileged, if you have the money, of course you're going to put your children in a very expensive school track. I think this is something that a lot of underprivileged students do not have to the very beginner track, especially if you're born and raised in a very poor family at the very beginner track. I think the moment that we actually like have full control of these parentings, we're not going to let these parents to actually like give out their children towards a very good school, very big instruction. Because what we're going to do here, we're going to actually like make sure that every single parent to actually like make their children go to the STEM school, STEM standard of schools, very big instruction. Which means that no parents can finally actually like put their privilege too much on their kids, because every single kid will need to go to the same school on the same exact age range, for the examples, right? This shows you that it will also work for underprivileged students, because the moment that the government actually like the one that in full control on how they should raise their children, the government are also going to the one that have the incentive to actually like make sure that the education standard will be very much uniform, regardless of this economic status, at the very beginning, right? I think this is something that's not going to exist in opposition, simply because if the government do not have this full power to actually like raise their children, these parents could always pick better schools if they're rich, for the examples, right? I think this is very, very unbeneficial for a lot of underprivileged students, simply because their parents do not have the privilege to do so, to the very beginning, right? So yeah, it's going to be at least every single children will have the same exact standing point at the very beginning, right? But moreover, I think it's also going to trickle down on how we're going to solve a lot of domestic problems, right? For example, it's like on how a lot of underprivileged parents are actually like raising their little girl to actually like do child marriage, simply because it's very hard for them to raise them, and this is one way they believe that this is one way for them to raise them, right? The moment that we actually like do this, we're not going to let any single parents to actually do this, simply because the way they raise their children will be in full control of the government, right? Which means that until their children is in adulthood, it will always be under supervision and always be under the standard that the government actually like imposed, or very beginner, right? Second argument here, how at the end of the day it can help the government better in terms of making the parents accountable, to the very beginner, right? I think in the current status quo, a lot of parents actually like escape their responsibility on their children, simply because the reason will be that they're actually like underprivileged, they don't have the capacity to do so, they're underprivileged, or very beginner, right? Basically, the moment that the government is actually like the one that in full control of it, the parents could not use that reason anymore, right? They need to follow it, simply because the government is going to be the one that first supervise it, but second is actually going to be that provide that very beginner, right? We're also going to concede that maybe opposition will say that we can just actually like educate their parents very beginner, right? But I think it will also trickle down to my first point of argument on how at the end of the day that will only based on privilege, and parents will always have full control to pick the best for their children, so education will not work. I'm very proud to oppose.
Prime Minister, for the final speech. Just a reminder for the leaders to keep the mic close to the program. As see when you hear the recommendation from the Prime Minister, just for the rest of the debaters, let's be mindful of that. And I would like to follow on with the opposition, the time is yours.
Oh. Apa sih? Mic. Oh, oke. Sorry. Oke, tes. Bentar ya. Alright, if you want to be alright, just stand up. Please don't make any noise. I have attention issue. Yep. Starting in 3, 2, 1. We believe that children are not tools of state development. We also believe that parents are not tools for reproduction, for states to be better. these kind of things will be concluded all in my speech. I will talk about two things. First, how does it take away inherent agencies of children to choose how to live their life and parentize as their own product of love. And secondly, how children should be raised and how it should be raised by love and by, all the things that you get at home. But before that, several framings. One, this is not a debate about bad parents versus bad states, because both are likely scenario. I think we can still argue that states are likely to be bad. For example, if they want certain products like militaries, for example, the soldiers whatsoever, like in Russia or any states that are full of wars, meaning that at best the harms are symmetrical if you want to argue about that. So what we should debate on is that how conflict control by states, even when it's at its optimum, is bad versus the optimum parenting of child rearing. But secondly, I want to note that this debate, based on the third person perspective, you don't really just care about the quality of children, but it's also the process that children feels. Insofar that happiness and also all the feelings that children can feel are determined by the way that they were raised, by all the process from they were 0 years old to 18 years old whatsoever, meaning that all the process of childhood, of how they were raised by love or not, matters in this debate. Therefore, two setups. One, what is the counterfactual? What do we prefer? We think that in our side, it doesn't mean that we give full control on parents, meaning that it's unjust for government to just argue that okay, we're going to give full control to parents, because in the status quo you need to notice that it's still monitored by the government, but it's just that parents have control about the choices that they want. There is still a child protection law and child protection bodies, for example, to help those children if they were being abused whatsoever. Secondly, there are also still welfare systems, funding, scholarship from government to help those children to be raised correctly, i.e. is KIPK, KIPK, i.e. also BPJS whatsoever to help those children to be raised correctly. And there's also counterbalance a lot of progressive body, for example, to help those children to thrive. But lastly, it's also how government also give fund on public school whatsoever. I don't think that OG have any sense in this debate, because all of these things are already mitigated by the mechanism that already exists on the status quo. But secondly, I want to challenge OG's mechanism. There need to be delta in this debate. I think government has to concede that in their side, states will have full control over children. What does it imply? It means that they're gonna be raised, most likely in a boarding house, for example, so they can have full monitor with CCTV, for example, with supervisor, for example, to know what these children are doing, what are they gonna do, what are their talents whatsoever. Meaning it's gonna be something that is static. It's gonna be something that is not dynamic at all. Meaning that even if logically in their side, if states want to have full control, then of course this is something that is a fiat that will happen in the side of the house. But secondly, it also have a specific goal, because be real, the way that parents can facilitate the choices of children are because they only have 2 to 5 children, or only one child, for example. In their side, states have millions of children to take care for. They need to generalize those standards to one goal, i.e. they want those children to be smart, i.e. they want those children to be productive, to be specific on their goals of life. They don't give any dynamic choices at all in the side of the house. Arguments. One, how does it take away in an agency of children? I'm going to divide in 2 ways. First, how states will manufacture the children's choices and preference at the end of the day. I think that it's likely for 3 reasons. Because states don't have emotional connections to the children, meaning that it's very easy for them to just dictate what do they want from these children, to take away everything that they want, i.e. who they want to be, i.e. just taking them to to assign them to the jobs that are not enough in the status quo, for example. But secondly, states are also stiff and based on manuals. They don't have any emotional intuition, for example, how do they raise their children. Oh, I want my children to smile, for example, when they go to holiday, for example. States don't have any of this incentive. What they want is those children to be good. But lastly, states are also too static and not adaptive. With your parents, if you fight, maybe tomorrow your mom will talk to you again, even she gave you silent treatment, just like my mom. But in their side, states won't talk to them. State most likely will only change the regulation when it's already too bad, for example, that it puts government to change something in the regulation or the standards that they make, meaning that even if at best you can change the standard, you already take away 3 to 5 years of the children's life, for example, that are being taken away by an unhappiness in the side of the house. Before I go on,
I think he definitely misunderstood the entire debate because we're not going to implement the standard towards the children. What we're going to do is to force the parents to follow the standard. Of course, we're not going to force children to be smart. We're forcing the parents to.
Yeah, I understand. That doesn't make sense because in a way that you have full control, it means that you want to have full supervision, for example. That you're gonna do this in their side. You have to constitute this or you will lose in this debate. And I think that I want to note that it's also going to break their agencies to choose and change because the context is here. We agree that we still have parents who also have preference on how do the children live their life. But it's okay because even we have to defend that parents' choices are not always good. A priori is the nature of regeneration because it comes from the parents' blood, for example, to build those children, for example, is the product of their love, is based on their choices to marry one another and get lust and love to make these children. But secondly, we can take the Buddha and say it's better because at least they have heart and they have incentive for discussion. They're more likely to change for these people. And I want to note in our side, it's not internally bad because you have counterbalance, i.e. you have extended family, for example. You can still get a from your grandmother, for example, on how should you raise your children. But secondly, you also have neighbors and schools parents, for example, telling you what is the correct way to raise your children. But lastly, they also ask psychologists, for example, to help you to understand better. I want to note that I know that in their side they still hire child psychologists, but in their side you don't get any discussions from parents. You don't know how does the children feel whatsoever. It's all being controlled by the government. And I want to know this. All things are important because in so far the agency is a prerequisite for children's happiness. We've been on this debate. But secondly, how should children be raised? I think the children should be raised by love and affection for the environment. It looks like two ways. It's not just love from their parents, but it's the love from their extended family, from their grandmother. That's why a lot of people are more close with their grandmother, for example. In their side, you lose all of these relations because those people are only gonna interact with the common children in the dorm, for example, or at best they're gonna only be this with the housekeeper, for example. There is no love bond. There is inherent based on every children. But secondly, children will only feel happy when they feel that they can fulfill their choice. That's why when you were a child, you were happy that you got a toy from your mom, for example. In their side, you didn't get all of these things because everything you have is regulated by the government. All the choices are being made by the government, meaning that you don't have all the uniqueness of choices of the life. You cannot be proud of who you are because there is no one to validate you because you have to fulfill the standard that the government takes to you. We're so proud to negate.
Test.
Okay. Ya, set timer.
I've never been consented to be born in this world where my parents cannot afford emotional, financial capacity to raise me as a child. Therefore, I think the only mechanism that able to save me from that situation, the arbitrarial factor, the unconsented factor within my parents who are not liable to basically raise me, only existing with the government supervision. So I think that's why the reason why we are so very proud to propose this motion. I think the reason why you cannot buy most of the majority of LO premise because they basically don't engage with the specific, metric of our model that has been provided by Prime Minister, because I think that we are very detailed and we are very, very, meticulous in our mechanization, that telling you that the impose of this mechanism does not directly go into the child, but also to a parent, that basically create an incentive for parents to be smart. So I think that it's going to be very, very not true under both opposition benches to suggest that this is going to not beneficial for kids, because what the prerequisite of children to be able to be good is basically to have parents who are the actor that basically impose a lot of stuff to their children. So I think these are the type of demography that we want to attack, that we want to solidify first before jumping to their children harm. So I don't think we should buy LO model. But I think the second reason why is that we think that there are very, very subjective subjective metric that basically they neglect in this debate, because we think that each countries, based on my Prime Minister mechanism, we believe that each countries and basically each places holds a very, very different standard, be it objective objective, be it subjective. So there is to suggest that also emotional standard is also being adjustable. So there is to say if some people, some government basically see that the majority of people who live in this country have an emotional attachment where their kids should be most of the time with their parents, I think we are going to also adjust to that. We're also going to give emotional freedom to kids with their parents, for example. I think this is going to be feasible because at the fiat, in this House Preferred Motion, I think we're going to imagine a whole world in which basically government is basically feasible enough to give a lot of incentive, a lot of time and freedom to basically prevent the emotional heartbreak, for example, as what LO said. So I think the likelihood and the thesis is very simple. Insofar that this basically insofar this basically government is basically have accountable the electoral factor basically that basically if only that you break all of the heart in emotional bound, I think that it's going to be so hard for them to upgrade. So I think the check and balance is still going to exist. But also, I'm going to engage further in my substantive. So extensions, right? Number one, I think I'm just going to, emphasize what PM has perfectly brought, because I think that Tami has perfectly established to you that the, world looks like now is very unfair. I have 5 important observations. Number one, kids are the victim of unconsented arbitrary factor. But number 2, economical struggle who prevent parents to have clear decision making pre-having child, not post-having child. Therefore, all of this pre-having child metric of decision making is very important under open government, because to give clear metric of objective pre-decision making of parents having child. But number 3, societal narrative of more kids, more blessing. For example, you have more child, more rezeki, etc. Make people have peer pressure of going to have birth without calculating everything before they have child. But number 4, lack of government supervision in basically like able to characterize what kind of preparation metric, for example, prep before you have children, etc. But number 5, child marriage prevalency under their side of the house, where basically there are a lot of the reason why this exists is because the reason why there's no mechanism for government to prevent this. I think this is why my prime minister mechanism fits perfectly, because I think number 1, the manifestation of having government constant intervention allows parents who already have kids to know or have a clear foundation of teaching to suggest and impose a certain objective. How does it look like? For example, government are basically getting a report, daily report, like per 3 quarter, for example, of what the kids update. For example, like the physical being, emotional being, the educational being, or for example, even if they all good in terms of like physical being, they're good in emotional being, but they lack financial. I think government is going to step in and giving a lot of like, for example, BLT incentive money for these, for example, parents to basically raise their children. So I think in terms of like benefit, I think it's basically going to be good for these children. But number 2, we create a better discussion where government in every specific layer, for example, government in central, government in local, I think they can basically incentivize a lot of people who have struggled. Because insofar that you see, for example, people who live in rural area, people who live in isolated area, where they don't have mechanism, they don't have psychology, they don't have like, mental health places, like what they say, the reason why, this local government is the only way that can reach them. They're the closest place they can access. And insofar the local government, the manifestation of it, they can reach people in isolated area, I think it's going to be good, because the check and balance, for example, the manifestation of seeing like, oh, my child have a problem in digestion, and because the fact that in isolated area you don't have any apothec, you don't have any medical center, therefore government also incentive is going to be further into that intervention is going to come in the form of building infrastructure, for example, building more places where people can go access. I think this is the type of intervention that we as the government willing to take, because the comparative research is very absent. You cannot really access all of this because government is not brave or bold enough to look what the model of is. Under our world, I think we are bold enough to characterize what kind of like types of lacking, for example. I think intervene to certain extent, giving a lot of incentive, building more and more infrastructure, allocating our APBN, for example, it's visible under opening government CO.
Basically, affirmative action exists because we do agree that children doesn't have rights to basically ask to be born. In yourself, the house, you take those rights away.
Even if we take those rights away, incentive that I just mentioned you, more accessible in facility can basically prep them to have more better objective. So it's still better. But number 2, I think that even if in the end of the day, this is about actual motion. This is not about actual motion. But the only way for OG benefit is basically to create a check and balance for government, so government can fly all the incentives that I just mentioned to you in my extension. So how does it look like to helping government back, right? I think this is why Tami's extension is very important, because if you actually intervene to the discussion in household, for example, seeing child and parent discussion about how government should be better, if the model is basically breaking the emotional detachment from parents from kids, I think the discussion that being intervened by government can supervise what kind of discussion that's happening in this household, I think government can actually see, oh, what kind of error they need to upgrade, what kind of check and balance they need to upgrade. So I think that therefore the government can work better under world that OJ established, because there's an incentive for them to keep seeing, do the direct intervention. He's basically engaged to all of the opposing, basically harm when they say that, oh, this is going to be intervening into their behavior of like child and parent, etc. So I think it's going to be better in terms of like check and balance. I think this is less important to buy emotional bound, because I think emotional bound is going to exist irrespective of whether or not there's a third party. Right now, government is basically having third party. They basically supervise us all the time. But I think this is not going to break emotional bound anyway. So I think parents can still be comfortable from their parents. But I think protection from relative psychology is contingent to characterization if relatives are aware. The fact that abuse happen constantly and prevalence is the reason why you cannot get this under the of the house. They basically contingent if only they can characterize why all households are good. I think this is able to help the emotional bond even further, because insofar that you have all of these benefits, I think it's also going to transcend, for example, to the emotional bond that you have if you get this benefit, and that's why we're proud to propose. Thank you.
Hi, can it be heard like this? Yes. Right. I'm going to take a point from closing to engage. The first thing that I came on framing is that OG is debating in bad faith, tweaking the mechanism to be unfair. Complete control means that the state has an entire control, as what LO claimed, that they said to be not engaging. I implore the closing teams to explore on our mechanism as opposed to opening government insofar as they tweak the motion to be unfair. I'm going to still engage to them though, just to make sure that they're out of the debate. Second, the counterfactual in OP is not full control of parents, that they are free to abuse their children and not give them proper food and education, but rather a harmonious coexistence. What we told you was that parents have control of the children, but the state can also supervise the way DPM claimed in their last 20 seconds, i.e. the state can also monitor the prevention of abuse. The state can also give things like support of free education, free welfare, and free healthcare. I think this coexistence is good because in our side we have counterbalance. In their side, it's fully on the state. The parents cannot speak up to the state necessarily because the full control, once more, exists on the state. And DPM final seconds of saying that, now state supervises but it doesn't break harmony is because it doesn't engage to the most basic inherent, concept of parenting, which is the emotional bond between your parents and children, right? The state does not regulate whether parents can show emotional vulnerability, whether parents can actually make meaningful connection to their children in a certain way that will be codified and will be standardized in their side. The first thing I'd address is the question, is there a universal way to raise children? And I will win this, this will win for opening opposition a priori. The first thing I'd argue is that there is not a universal way to raise children because of three unique reasons. Number one, a priori everyone is different since their birth, i.e., you are born in a certain way that even if you engage a race together, even if you're born as twins, you can have multiple different personalities that you cannot be generalizing to begin with. Secondly, and empirically speaking, even if they were born the same, children change throughout the process, i.e. some people mature easier than another. Some people learn about things better than another because of things like birth lottery. And therefore, you can necessarily find a universal way to raise your children in that sense. But lastly, consider the parent-child relationship. I think it's not static, but rather dynamic. Often parents have, expressed love in a unique way that is uncanny to the general standard, i.e. from different culture. Asian culture who prefers tiger parenting. Western cultures who prefer libertarian parenting. But in the end, the children can both equally compete to get into the top schools like Harvard. The conclusion is twofold. Number one, the children are going to be static in their side of the house insofar as they generalize all the treatment. But secondly, what we told you was that parents will only become a tool for the state for reproduction, and the parents will only become a tool for the state to provide them the necessary human resources that the states need for development. And for the reasons that DPM gave you, that we will give consideration, this means that the parents who want to have children to begin with are parents who initially want to nurture their children, who want to build meaningful connection, that their children will be taken away on the counterfactual. Second thing I'd address is that I think government policy is at best discriminative. Their objective standard, first of all, is not feasible, and this is important. Objective standard of anti-child marriage and abuse is predicated on the state's political orientation, and you cannot fiat that states are always going to be good in their side. Insofar as you talk in bad states like Middle East, for example, probably with discriminative conduct against women, presumably the state think that the objective standard is that you should allow your children to marry at the age of 13. That will be the objective standard that they want in their side. This is not going to be my contribution because this is worst case, and I think CEO cannot extend on this as well because this is worst case. But this is where our framing was important, that this is never a debate about bad states versus bad parents, but rather a priori, the conception of who should have control over the children. Is it the state fully or the coexistence that is harmony in our side of the house? But consider the best case. Even if it is feasible to be objective, I would argue that it's going to be racist, sexist, and discriminative. Because in order for you to create an absolutely objective standard, you cannot use emotions. You cannot use subjective standards. You need to formulate the specific metric that can be calculated, i.e. it has to be arithmetic. It has to be mathematic, that I can subtract and add from it. I.e. if you have this specific identity or specific economic condition, you're not supposed to have children insofar as you're mathematically incapable to support your child's living to the fullest. And I will argue that the standard has to be high, because in order for opening government's benefit to run, then they have to operate on the scenario where the standard is extremely strict, that every single children who are going to be born are going to be subject to all the privileges that exist in their side of the house. So this substantially limits not only the rights of parents to reproduce, but rather the continuation of things like culture and tradition, the continuation of generational traditions that will otherwise exist in our side. The last defense that they have was that we will give pre-having children consideration. I would argue that in our side of the house, things like the rise of child-free discourses and a lot of other things have already provided enough counterbalance for you to think whether or not you want to have children to begin with. And insofar as that's true, you have to believe that people who want to have children are inherently people who are emotionally capable, for example, or people who just generally want to build a meaningful connection with their children that I think will be limited substantially in their side. Closing. 3. Yeah, go.
PM has established that even if child protection law exists, unprivileged parents will still use this as an scapegoat due to the fact that they are not rich and privileged enough and won't engage to it anyways.
The counterfactual is that non-privileged parents, that is, by the way, calculated mathematically, is not going to be able to have children anyway in their side, insofar as they don't fulfill this objective standard anyway. But also economic status changes. Like if parents suddenly go broke midway of having children, and presumably the state will take full control, and therefore all of our harms or our leader of opposition exists, and therefore that cannot be a bullet opening government wants to take. The second thing I'd suggest is the control of the state substantially negates the access of agency. And the question here is that, are the states more likely to manufacture or aggregate the children's preferences? 6 reasons in extension why it's likely to be manufacturing. Number 1, the state has an a priori specific demographic needs, and therefore they have assigned that, people who are born as males should work in this specific sector. People who have this specific intelligence level must work in this specific sector, and they will, they will modify their curriculum in their side to fulfill that specific standard. Secondly, is the incentive structure, right? Because even if the states are not evil, it's largely democratic or at least political, and therefore the states want to maintain their political legitimacy to ensure the continuation or sustainability of the state, that they impose the heavy burden on the children to fulfill the specific role in the society to ensure survivability. Thirdly, is you have no emotional connection at all, because the states or even the parents in their side will have less time to emotionally engage with their children, insofar as it's going to be substantially limited. But even if the state controls the children, then probably you have a lot of children to cater to, right? You cannot build a meaningful connection to each individual of them. Fourthly, children are not going to be unique in their side. Children are going to just be tools. They're just going to be new people, new batch of individuals who are going to be processed like stormtroopers, like, you know, a lot of individuals who are designated for a specific role in their side. Fifthly is the vastly unequal bargaining power. The children cannot speak up to the state because children cannot vote, but the state can make meaningful policies that will substantially restrict what the children can or cannot do, what the children are allowed or are not allowed to do. At least in our side of the house, with a meaningful connection of parents, children are individuals who are deemed to be special by their parents, right? Parents listen to their children even if there is probably some kind of hierarchy, but the emotional connection that is exclusive in our side is unique. But lastly is the demand of objectivity, and therefore, what the conclusion is twofold. Number one, I hate the argument overused of children do not consent, because in their side, children also do not consent to be born in a specific state. What exists in our side then is the ability for parents to be dynamic in the parenting and be making good decisions based on the happiness of their children. Negate.
Position for the client's speech from member to issues.
Test.
Let's kick OG out of this debate because they brought two things. First, they talk about how they're able to provide equality by doing reports. Two problems with this, right? First, we question if their benefits is actually going to run things such as like child marriage, because these types of things already exist in law and protection, such as the one coming from opening opposition. But note that second of all, if children and parents, if your only check and balance is simply doing a report every 3 months, then like parents also have the incentive to lie because they don't want their children to be taken away from them, right? The comparative is that we'll actually play upon the best case of opening opposition and bite their bullet upon their mechanization, such as like moving these children to boarding house system. Now, what is the missing characterization that is missing by the opening bench? We think that by complete control of child rearing, we will force parents to send their children, for example, to another city or basically to a boarding school. But note that access to parents still exists under our side of the house, because we think that government is not entirely evil. Parents can still visit their children, bring them home-cooked meals every single weekend, for example. Why is this likely? Because if parents have full control, like most likely they'll raise you until like maybe like 12 years old, and then we'll take them away. So we think that some form of emotional build-up still exists, emotional connection still exists under our side of the house, just that we're going to move them to another, for example, like boarding school, like maybe at the age of 12 years old or so, right? We think that at the end of the day, government is also not entirely evil just to steal kids and use parents as a reproductive tool. We think that under our side of the house, we're still going to give some form of benefit towards parents because, yeah, we owe it to them, right? Now, why pressure? We think one of the urgency that is missing is that pressure exists under our side of the house. This acts as an urgency because first, when children goes home, for example, they're already very exhausted, yet they still have to they still have to face their parents, they still have to obey to the parents' rules and demands, right? Now, the comparative is that at least under our side of the house, you go home to your dorm, you meet your friends and etc. You don't have to constantly please your parents, and like the moment when they see you as an investment, they have additional pressure. But second of all, there is also academic pressure, right? This means that high schoolers are also not naive and blank-minded. Maybe they know that they're bad at math, but they don't need constant reminder that they are really bad at math. Like they may excel in other types of fields, such as arts and sports, but the parents don't acknowledge these kinds of things, right? Now, we think that all of this leads to things such as depression, mental pressure, and even leads to less productivity and how these children absorb the lessons later. Now, Going to my rebuttals towards opening opposition. First, they talk about how children's choices and parents, like, they have lesser choices. First, state don't have emotional connection. We think that under our side of the house, we already tackle this by our mechanization on how we're still able to, for example, have Zoom calls or simply like call them and in our free time, like at night or so, right? Now, we think also emotional connection also exists in other ways, right? Besides you actually, like, your parents visit you in the weekend, you still have people around you. You're surrounded by people, right? This means you are going to build some form of emotional connection that is symmetrical, like you're able to share things, you share feelings with your roommates. Now, second, we think they also mention about how parents are much more flexible. We think two reasons why this is wrong. First, discussion with parents and children. We think this is very best case scenario under OG because we think that there is a certain hierarchy that already exists in status quo that parents have to expect that they are the ones that have authority, especially since the day that you're born. So the moment when you want to have a fruitful discussion, they're going to see you as rebellious, they're going to see you as complaining to them, not appreciative enough to the things that they do to you. They're going to say things like, oh, back then we didn't have this, so you shouldn't complain. The moment when parents see these children as rebellious, like you lose your authority, then they're just going to scold you and discussion is not going to happen. The comparative is that under our side of the house, you have a better form of discussion in your boarding houses. First, you have better relatability. This means that your day-to-day struggles, your friends is going to understand that. You're able to talk about how you're facing depression, how you're facing anxiety, and etc. At least you have people that's going to listen to you and you have someone to lean on. Second, you have easier access to professional help. Right now, parents are close-minded. So like if you see your children as depressed, you're going to see them and blame them as someone that is problematic, right? They're just going to neglect you. But at least under our side of the house, you have much better form of discussion, going to the therapy and etc. Like there's no constant pressure from your parents. Go.
None of these harms from cozy government are exclusive in our side. We told you that in state, they are demanded by democratic mandate in their side. If that's the culture, then they will also implement no professional help in their side. The comparative is at least in our side, it's going to be more dynamic and less static.
But under your side of the house, you still face the constant pressure by your parents. You still face the constant, for example, pressure that you are not, like you're not supposed to have mental health. You're supposed to get good grades. By the moment when you take these away from your parents, you have better, at least peace of mind under our side of the house, right? Now, we think that under our side of the house, we're just going to use things such as visits. We think this is enough because at least you don't spend your day fighting with your parents. The moment when you go home, like you can rest, for example, or recharge your social battery. And the moment when you meet your parents in the weekend, it's going to be much more fruitful because now your parents know, I have a very limited time with you. I'm not going to spend it fighting you. I'm actually going to take you out for food, going to take you out to the theme park, and etc. Right? So, like, you're going to have much better fun time with your family. Going to my extension then, why character and value development is important, and it's better under our side. We think 3 things children need to grow to be a decent person, and this can be fulfilled by the state. First, if like you want children to grow to be someone good, you only need moral values such as honesty, like teaching them certain moral value on why they should do good in society. This does not have to exclusively come from parents. Second, things about social skills. Like parents don't even teach social skills to begin with. Third, if you want your children to grow up to be a decent person, at least, for example, they are able to know things such as like how to treat a woman better, or like how to treat them as an equal, things such as against discrimination and racism. We tackle this better, and we can tackle all of this. Because in CG, we have teachers who can literally teach them why they should be honest. They have a better form of analysis, such as how teachers can literally explain if you are honest towards people, society is also going to reward you the same way. So you have a much better society, for example. These types of analysis is lacking in parents, where parents only tell you, yeah, you should be honest, but they never tell you why, or they don't have the simple capacity to do so, right? Basically, teacher and state will give this analysis on why certain moral value is important and how you can apply it in your day-to-day life. Second, social skill will happen anyways. Third of all, we think that teachers are not biased and have lesser pressure towards kids. Like, if you constantly teach them about honesty, we think that sooner or later, it will be the basic morale in their life, and they're going to apply it from their day-to-day life. Why this cannot happen in opening opposition or opposition side in general? 2 things. Their benefit relies on 2 things. First, parents are already progressive, right? This means the moment when a majority of parents are actually not progressive enough, you don't have these kinds of value. Second, parents might not have the capacity to do that, because parents like who lived from 40 years ago are very conservative, very racist in general, right? So we think the value that you're going to teach anyways is not going to be that good. Thank you.
Ulala, sorry. Oh my god. Hello, am I audible? Okay. Okay. We should kick OG out of the debate, right? Because their mechanism is counterproductive, right? Because the moment that they're going to say that this is going to be like heavily, they're going to like give some sort of freedom towards the parents to be able to teach this kind of like children. Therefore, it's also depending towards externalities. Therefore, we don't see like why is it suddenly that people are going to like uniformize and whatever it is. Even let's say the parents are still going to be the one that is going to be uniformized. You need to understand that this also levels to the extent where children are also going to be uniformized under their side of the house. Therefore, the harm also still exists under their side of the house, right? Let's say that they want to say that regarding on how there will still be some sort of discussion and whatever it is, we don't understand why government suddenly will have the incentive to actually have this kind of like discussion, because at the end of the day, this kind of like complete control means in the form of how you have like a objective perspective itself. The moment that you're going to put a lot of different perspective itself, the moment that you're going to make it harder for this kind of like government to achieve their goal and whatever it is, right? Second thing on that open government mentioned to this debate is regarding on how this is going to protect the underprivileged or whatever it is. You need to understand that current society already exists and current society already understands what the problems they currently accessing are in their side of the house. Therefore, we don't see any urgency itself, right? Even let's say this talking about isolated area and whatever it is, then just educate these kind of like people coming from the government itself, instead of like taking away their rights, taking away their options to be able to choose their freedoms and to choose their option independently itself, right? Therefore, we question the importance under OG. Therefore, OG have no contribution towards this debate, right? Moving on to CG then. CG comes to debate telling you that emotional attachment and build-up will exist. That is not true, right? Because you need to understand how a child operates, right? You need to understand that child will only listen or will have a huge amount of trust to the people that are with them towards the entire life itself, right? Therefore, we have like an emotional attachment with our parents because we see them every day. They are the one who dictates us. They are the one who teach us whatever it is. The moment that they are taking away their parents out of like the picture, therefore, most likely they are going to have attachment towards the government. Therefore, most likely this kind of like children will only be troops and only be like robots, some sort of like robots towards the government itself. Therefore, we question the emotional build-up that you're going to mention, right? Second thing that I mentioned is regarding on how this is going to be very hard for this kind of like children because you're going to be very tired from the schools and whatever it is. You need to understand that pressure also exists at their side of the house, right? It's going to be so much worse because they're currently under your side of the house. Government is the one who's going to dictate you to do some sort of like pressure and whatever it is, right? It is going to be very harmer, right? Because at the end of the day, there's going to be like direct punishment coming from the government itself, right? Especially in the context where there is not going to be any check and balances because under your side of the house, even let's say that this pressure coming from parents is incredibly cruel, it's going to be like have some sort of check and balances where government can actually put some sort of like control out of it. For instance, in the case of how if parents abuse a certain children, there will be like Komnas HAM that can take away their children to be able to protect the children and whatever it is. The moment that they have like complete control of these kind of children itself, what is going to happen is there's no check and balances because there's no other perspective rather than the parents, rather than the government perspective itself, right? We also would argue that rebellion is something that's necessary, right? Because it's a necessary effort for you to be able to like have some sort of good check and balances within the discussion, and we're going to prove to you under our argument later on, right? Then why do we top over OO? You need to understand that OO arguments regarding happiness is not that important, right? You need to understand because it's very dependent on a lot of externalities. You need to see the reality that a lot of things don't go according to your plan. Therefore, we argue that the happiness that they're going to defend is something that's very fluctuative and considered a lot of externalities. Therefore, we're going to bring you a much bigger value, right? We're going to tell you, like even let's say you're going to have like some sort of like downs in your life, we believe that is actually fine because you're going to be able to have some sort of like meaning in your life, and you're also going to be able to like have some sort of like communal check and balances that are going to be so much better under your side of the house, right? Moving on to my argument then, I'm going to bring two things under my speech. First, I'm going to tell you why it shapes a robotic individual in a sense of how you're not going to be able to value this kind of like meaning of life. And second, I'm going to tell you how it's going to create a society that is going to be very bad because it's going to like hampers the check and balances mechanism under their side of the house, right? First thing first, regarding the meaning of life. First, you need to understand what this kind of like complete control will actually look like, right? Most likely, this kind of like government is going to shape how individual thinks, how these children thinks, and whatever it is. Like, you need to understand that the moment that this kind of like government shapes the way you think, most likely they're going to like cater towards the interest of the government itself, right? This is going to be very problematic, right? Because children are going to like listen towards the people that are going to be closest to them and whatsoever it is. This is going to be very problematic because there's no other perspective that, like I've mentioned before, right? This is what is missing from OO, right? OO mentioned to you that this is kind of like there's no discussion and the government will dictate you and whatsoever it is. Then the question comes to why suddenly like things will change under us of the house, right? You need to understand the moment that we have like there's no complete control, what's going to happen is you're going to have a perspective coming from the parent itself, right? Because the moment that you don't put the parent in the picture itself, the only rationalization and the only character building and whatsoever it is are only going to be dependent on the state itself, right? Under of the house, there's also always going to be like a family or the parents in the picture itself, where you're also still going to be able like have some sort of like check and balances within the ideas, whether or not this idea is going to be something that's good or not, right? Why is this important, right? Because at the end of the day, this is going to give you some sort of value of life, right? Because the moment that government are actually the one that's going to dictate you, most likely they're going to like use you for economy and whatsoever it is, right? Why is this likely? Because they're going to say that it's under the name of welfare and whatsoever it is, on how do you have like incentive to compete with other states with international relations and whatsoever it is. This is better than stereotyping that is brought by opening opposition regarding on how they will use certain gender to specify a certain thing and whatsoever it is. This is incredibly important, right? Because you need to understand that not every individuals or not every children want economic benefits or want to have like a rich benefits and whatsoever it is. Therefore, under of the house, this meaning of life is important, right? Because under of the house, you're going to be able to have like certain options to be able to choose your life and whatsoever it is. Under of the house, it's okay if like this is going to be certain doubts because at the end you're going to be able to learn something from it. This is already an important benefit under of the house, right? Moving on to my second argument that regarding on why under of the house we're going to be able to create a better check and balances. You need to understand that what is going to happen under of the house, most likely check and balances is not going to be working, right? Because like what I've mentioned to you on how it's going to be one-dimensional and whatsoever it is. What is going to be the problem with this, right? Because under this of the house, people are not going to have agency, right? Because first, they feel like they have no option because at the end of the day, a lot of like their circles and individuals are using this kind of like a parameter and whatsoever it is. Therefore, it is going to invalidate their concern and whatsoever it is. As they see that this is something that's uncommon, therefore they're going to like just put aside their doubts and whatsoever it is. Second of all, the idea of how this will lead into how there's no government check and balances and whatsoever it is, because under this of the house, government can do whatever they like, right? This is better than all, right? Because they just mentioned that voting and whatsoever it is, but this kind of like harm extends towards even, let's say, after you already have this voting rights, right? Because you are already naturalized towards the idea on how you have no option and you should obey what exactly that the government is actually bringing to you, right? Even let's say in the best case scenario where government is good and whatsoever it is, we believe that the uniformized idea that have no other perspective rather than the government perspective is very bad, right? Because it harms the idea of how you're going to be able to innovate yourself and whatsoever it is, right? On the idea of how you're going to be, there's going to be a less chance for you to have like a fruitful discussion towards diverse perspectives that are going to be able to like create a better policy and whatsoever it is, right? Why is this the most important thing under this debate today, right? Because we have provided to you the reason why under us of the house, you're going to be able to fulfill your meaning of life because the one is detecting you and whatsoever it is, and how you're going to be able to build a more better society because you're going to like have incentive for you to voice out your concern. Very proud to oppose.
Test. Okay. POI, I can accept from opening opposition or closing opposition. Yeah. All right. Just stand up. No need to make any noises whatsoever. Okay. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panels. Let's talk about framing here. First, the burden of government is indeed to be and take the bold stance of actually having boarding schools to actually be manifested under government. This is why OG is indeed out of this debate. I think the whole room is already reaching on a consensus that OG is going to be kicked out of this debate, right? Secondly, how coexistent that is being meant by Justin and Hezron is going to manifest. First, what is going to happen with coexistence when government teaches education and parents then teach also education regarding moral value? There is tendency and high likelihood of there is clashes between this actual teaching. This then looks like when we know that we are actually intellectually smart, but we are very rebellious exactly the moment where your parents teach you, oh, you do not need to be smart in your school. It's about character that matters. Right now, you just try, you rebel out whatsoever, be naughty in your school, and that's what's going to happen even more under opposition, right? Secondly, how then this becomes much worse and harmful? Exactly because OO say that any parenting is already extremely subjective. Yes, exactly, Justin. This is why it's so much more that children does have a very bad and performing very bad in academics. The mismatch of education is just that great of education at home and school. It becomes inherently harmful. Why we win over every team in this room? Opening government, yes. Opening government wanted we to force the parents to own, not the children. I think OG case becomes weak and not in line to actually fulfill the burden of proof of actual government here. OG out of this debate. Right, regarding opening opposition here, 3 arguments, I think that's 4 arguments here. 1, parents become tools of reproduction. Inherently, right now there is parents who doesn't even understand that they don't have the capacity to actually raise a child, and these are the parents to still have actual children. This means us creating the underprivileged narrative and whatsoever. And this is exactly, even when the child-free movement exists, it's not enough. It's still happening. So inherently, all of those movements aren't actually solving much problem. It's still happening in a country like us in Indonesia. Secondly, government has millions of children to take care of. It's very inaccessible to happen under government. This is what Hezron said, right? 1, this is already proven that China is already doing some sort of boarding school. This is the example that it's very, very feasible when inherently we're going to create those boarding schools, and we have the capacity, we have the money, we have the teachers. Yes, we're going to do training programs, how teachers is going to be better, how it's going to be much more generalized, so that all of the education can actually be equal amongst underprivileged and also amongst the highest privilege. Yes, we have to admit that the high privilege would most likely still have certain benefits that, after high school or whatsoever, they're going to go to school outside of university, outside of the country, and etc. Inherently, I think this argument doesn't fly because in the end of the day, high privilege is still going to prevail over the underprivileged, but at least under government, we give you that chance for underprivileged children to at least have the education, to at least have some sort of equal treatment in the eyes of the government. Now, this third argument here coming from opening opposition is that at least they have hearts. I think this is very similar to what closing opposition said when closing opposition said that, children are not allowed to be super robotic. The same argument, same premise here. So there's no inherent difference, OO and CO. Now, at least that have hearts. Inherently, there is we have to question, is robotic but truthful worse than valueless children and racist? This comes from predetermined teaching from parents that are irresponsible, that were taught of how being racist is good and whatsoever. Then opposition opposition has to prove to you why being robotic is so much more harmful. First, it isn't. It looked like a China from all the total control do exist, where there is 5 days a week on school, you don't go home, and 2 days with your parents. This inherently looks, even if they become socially awkward, they're still one of the best engineers in the world. Their economy grows and whatsoever. And even when they are in boarding school, they are going to still have interaction with their friends. So there is still emotional connection under opposition. It's going to be better now, exactly because you put your children in a situation where you have to make friends, or not, you're going to be very lonely, right? Inherently more incentive then for children to not be socially awkward. But before that,
The problem is the extent of the fiat from God. We claim that objectively good standards is not given and dynamic is important. I.e., the unique differences between children will make them happier. In God, they will be generalized. This is also logically prior to that CO derivative extension of meaning.
right. So this means that there's inherent happiness that's going to exist under opposition. One, we have to question, are people right now able to be unhappy? Yes. All of the classes here, people here know that even those who are being raised by their parents can be unhappy in some extent. This harm is not symmetrical. This looks like me being here that have some sort of mental issues and whatsoever. Parents can indeed cause certain problems. It's not an exclusive harm that's only exists on government. It's then a harm that's symmetrical. Now, if we can then counter all the alternatives that opening opposition have, like child protective services, free healthcare, etc., then they have nothing to fight and win in this debate. One, at best, this only run after the abuse does happen. Under government, we are able to protect and prevent exactly when we actually create the actual narrative. The argument of Dennis manifests in way as action becoming the actual real action to become a prevention of abuse to happen in the first place. This benefit is exclusive because in boarding school, we make strict policy regarding physical abuse, inherent shouting and whatsoever, to then be able to sanction those who are doing physical abuse and whatnot. This literally prevents any harm or any need to have child protective services. Inherently, all their benefit falls under government. Now, talking about closing opposition, argument same. There's no inherent difference here, right? So arguments of CO is based on the idea that children, the question comes up of are being super robotic. Are they engaged to it? No inherent difference between opening opposition, closing opposition. Closing opposition cannot then win over us in closing government. Here, then they fall. Now, what are the weighing that we should measure here under this narrative? The pressure for government or pressure for parents? Government don't bash you when you do bad. They don't have incentive to do so. But parents' pressure look like inherently bashing you the moment that you are failing in school, that you have no friends and whatsoever. Even if the pressure exists under both sides of the house, exactly because the pressure doesn't come from real connection, it doesn't really harm the children. Propose.
I'm audible. Wait. Kau sekarang? Oh ya, oke. Prioritizing apa sih kalian? CG, but if OG want to POI, why not? I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. This is the problem with the entire debate, right? All of the bench's argument except for CO is talking about how does happiness could be reached for this kind of children. Why does happiness is the most important thing for this kind of children to basically earn the value in the life itself, right? It's as of treating and explaining about how everything people do is actually to achieve happiness, and that is the main goal of living in this life itself, right? This is why CO will win this debate, right? CO basically the only bench that is explaining to you about how does the meaning of life is not only to seeking happiness itself, even with all of the externalities, checking about whether or not the parents are going to be abusive, whether or not the parents are going to have an emotional attachment towards this kind of children. At the end of the day, we say life is going to still be very meaningful for this kind of children at the end of the day, talking about how the most important thing is on how these children could actually have a better growth in the closing opposition, talking the moment that fate of this kind of children goes into this kind of parents, regardless they are bad parents or good parents at the end of the day. Now, let's kick OO out of this debate, and why does CO will be more contributive rather than OO, right? OO came basically talking about one thing, right? All of their argument are tangible, talking about whether or not these kind of parents are actually wise enough to basically be a good parents toward this kind of children at the end of the day. Assuming in the worst case scenario, talking about how does the moment that this kind of parents actually become abusive, like the government side of the house cases, then their case will fall down, right? This is the differentiation between opening opposition and closing opposition. Our side of the house is not tangible towards whether or not the parents are going to be good or not, because basically in our side of the house, what we are trying to do, right, is we're emphasizing on whether or not these kind of children at the end of the day will have a good life. About how the most important thing that we want to tell to you is on how does happiness in our side of the house, talking about how these children should be grateful in the beginning, right? That's how you are going to, this kind of children could achieve the more absolute happiness at the end of the day. The happiness even in the cases of opening opposition is talking on how does the moment that these kind of children are actually always get this kind of happiness, always get good parents, they will never be grateful enough at the end of the day. This is what leads to about how people will never seek any more happiness the moment that they always get it their entire life, right? In our side of the house, the moment that you have perseverance, right? The moment that you have this kind of hard things that you have went through your life in the beginning, even with this kind of parents, at least we say the most important thing is the moment that you first feel grateful, you fight for your own happiness. That is how the better happiness will be achieved, even with good or bad parents. What does this shows you? This shows you even the prerequisite towards the happiness that will be achieved by the opening opposition came by NG's speech, talking about this kind of condition at the end of the day, right? But second of all, NG is the only side of opposition that actually gave you the manifestation of dictating and how does it going to look like and why is it bad, right? This is exactly the things, the contribution coming from CO that opening opposition never care about, because they simply say about how the whole government side of the house is very dismissive, right? We talk to you about how the moment dictating actually happening, the moment government have this kind of absolute control, the moment every check and balances that government wanted to be achieved at the end of the day, this is basically about how dictatorship starts in the beginning, right? The cases coming from the government actually happens 70 years ago. That's what we call Nazi Germany, right? The moment that this kind of society actually being fully controlled by the society, by the government, the moment that this kind of children are raised by this kind of government, the moment that everything the government said becomes a propaganda towards the society, and the society doesn't have any more check and balance under the side of government side of the house, and that is exactly what is going to happen. Then we are the only side of the house that is actually take this kind of burden, explain it to you. We say CO is more contributive than OO. Now let's engage towards the whole government OG less, because we decide to throw them away, right? Now for CG, right? CG basically brought three things in this debate, right? First of all, they are talking about how parents doesn't have the capacity to raise the children, etc., right? We say about how at the end of the day, even if parents doesn't have the capacity, we have this kind of mechanism already exists in the status quo that is called children protective service, right? If your parents are abusive, we say about how this kind of government body could basically take this kind of children. We say the preemptive measure already exists even in our side of the house. Therefore, we say about how the things that the government side of the house should actually protect in this debate is talking about why does emotional connection between the parents and the children is actually a bad thing and a bad condition itself. Therefore, they doesn't want any more emotion. The moment CG still brings this kind of stance like the OG, therefore they are also debating under the same half stance, and it's about how it's not as contributive as the closing opposition, which already proved to you about how does emotion is the most important thing, whether or not at the end of the day there will be have a good connection or a bad connection with this kind of parents. Therefore, the happiness that will be achieved, even if it's not going to be happiness, we say it's still going to be better, right? But second of all, we say about how even in the worst case scenario, right? We say about how that children their parents doesn't have the capacity, at least when they grew up older enough, right? They could run away from their kind of parents. What will happen and how it will look like in the government side of the house, right? In the government side of the house, what will happen, because basically government is the only part that actually holds the power, that means absolute power, right? The moment government actually abolish and do some bad things, there is no counter mechanism and no countermeasure for this kind of children to be exiting from these kind of things at the end of the day. This is exactly how, in the government side of the house, the check and balances that they wanted will never be achieved. But before that, OG.
If it's true that both OO and CO nuances are emotional and meaning of life, which are subjective and out of the touch of objective metric that OG champion, both of them can still go hand in hand without distracting one another.
Okay, I'm basically going to explain to you in next class, right? But first I'm going to CG with, right? Now, CG talking about how emotional build-up is not likely to happen in ourselves, etc., right? Talking about how bad parents itself. We say about how emotionality, you will gain it not only from this kind of parents itself, right? We say about how, for example, I have an abusive parents, NG have an abusive parents, now we're best friends, right? Talking about how at the end of the day, the same fate that actually we've done through, but how a lot of other people have better life at the end of the day, we see this kind of problem itself. We say about how we have the connection itself at the end of the day. In the cases of governments of the house, basically because no differences is going to happen, right? Every children is going to be raised the same way, but how does these kind of things are going to be good? That is the assumption coming from the government, right? This is the simplest reason why closing government will never win this debate. Basically the whole government, right? They are depending their cases whether or not the government is actually a good actor or a good actor in this debate, right? The moment we already proved to you every fall mechanism coming from this kind of government that it doesn't really actually care towards the society, but there is a moment where this kind of government could actually be a bad actor in this debate. That is the moment their cases falls, right? But now let's engage towards the opening government also, right? Opening government basically brought the idea about how they will still have this kind of parents to basically control, right? We say about how the moment that this kind of things happen through this half stance is talking about how that these children will only be confused whether or not they should stick to their parents or to their government, right? Because basically in yourself, the house, you are not going to let these kind of children have fully emotional towards this kind of parents, but you're not also not going to basically let the government to pick all of the details of their life pro to oppose.